so that we have it going. And you know what, we all are come through pretty clearly, so I think we can keep it on our video for now, and if somebody starts to get a bad connection, we'll worry about it later. But for now, I want to start off with each of you individually introducing yourselves for maybe 15 seconds each. So it's going to be tough to go in order, but how about John, since you're on my screen first to start?
Sure. My name's John Lester, hacker handle count 0. I currently live in Montreal, Canada. I was one of the co-founders of the original LØpht when it spun up in the south end of Boston. And I am a longtime member of the Cult of the Dead Cow. That's it.
Great. By the way, one more thing, Stella. For anybody who's not talking, just mute yourself because we got 8 guys. Everything's fine for now, but you know. How about Space Rogue? You want to go? Introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Space Rogue.
Okay.
A man of few words.
I was a member of LØpht Heavy Industries. I used to run Hacker News Network, Black Mac Archives. I've since done Cyber Squirrel 1. Currently work at IBM and live in the Philadelphia area.
Great. Just one thing, you're coming through a little roomy, so you might want to get slightly closer to your microphone, but that's just something to consider.
Is that okay? Better?
I don't think that's the microphone that's coming through. Nonetheless, well, we'll figure it out. How about Chris, you want to go next? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Weishopel. My hacker name is Weld Pond. I joined the LØpht back when we were at the Waltham Street location in Boston, and I guess I was part of the software vulnerability research group of the LØpht as we got to later, and LØpht Crack was one of the projects I worked on.
Joe?
All right. Hi, my name is Joe Grand, also known as Kingpin. I joined the LØpht in '92 when I was 16. So all through my formative years in both the old space and the new, so kind of 2 separate lives there. And I live out in Portland, formerly the anarchist jurisdiction of Portland. And I teach hardware hacking and electronics and pretty much do everything I was doing at the LØpht, but somehow made it into a living.
All right, Christian.
Hi, my name is Christian Ryu, also known as Dildog, longtime member of the Cult of the Dead Cow as well, and the first paid employee of the LØpht. I was doing advisories in hacking Windows and Internet Explorer when the LØpht folks and I managed to meet up at our 2600 meeting. They dragged me in and got me a desk so I could hack on LØpht Crack and back Orifice 2000 and a bunch of other stuff. So today I'm living outside of Washington, D.C. and doing security for a large fruit company.
Cool. So my first question may be for John or any of you who were around at that time. I just want to know, how did LØpht get started and why?
Place to store all of our stuff. That's what happened. The virtual background for me is actually my desk at the original LØpht photo of that. We used to make a lot of whipped cream products here. You can see the yeah, it was basically me and Brian Oblivion were living in the South End in the same brownstone, different floors. And it was 2 things. One, we were collecting a lot of hardware from the MIT flea market. We're like, wow, our respective significant others are complaining about all this stuff that's sitting in the house. And also, our significant others were looking to start up a business making hats. It's a long story, but anyway, they were like, we need a big work area. And so basically Oblivion and I were like, maybe there's some kind of a loft space we can rent around here, because the South End at the time was, it was not gentrified as it is now. It was mostly artists. And there were a lot of industrial areas that were just sort of, big open spaces, wood floors, open beam ceilings and all that stuff. And so we were looking around and we found a place like right around the corner in the South End from where we lived. And we're like, man, we can just get this space here. And at the time, we were also interested in the hacker community in Boston and beyond. And we had, you know, made friends with people in other countries. Remember in the Netherlands, the hacktick people who were like, you know, creating these sort of things. They were calling them like hacker spaces. And it's like, it's kind of a cool idea, the space where we could just kind of have people hang out. And I had started working with Emmanuel Goldstein at 2600 Magazine to spin up 2600 meetings in the Boston area, because he was, was talking to him one day and he's like, yeah, there's nothing going on in Boston. Why don't you just start something? I'm like, okay. And that dovetailed eventually with Jason Scott doing stuff for the Works as well, which is awesome. And so then it just kind of all came together and we ended up having, it's like, oh, this is rent this space, ta-da. First thing we did was we filled it with stuff like this. And then at some point, I can't remember what happened, but at some point there was somebody in the, I think it was Mass Ioneer, they were decommissioning, or somewhere else, they were decommissioning like an old VAX. It's like, yeah, we could put a VAX, you know, mainframe computer in here too. Why not? This is, we got the space. And so it just kind of filled up with stuff and then people hanging out there. And, you know, that was always, you know, the initial magic was just, it became a space where people were brought together, where they had access to hardware they could play around with. We started collecting tons of manuals that we either bought at the flea market, the MIT flea market. People were like, do you have the manual for this weird thing? It's like, yeah, actually we do. You just come, there's a stack of them like this. Why don't you come over and read them, you know? And that's really how it all formed.
Yeah,
So
I
go ahead.
think a lot of like, you know, the history of the loft that we see is sort of what we call the new loft, right? So that would be like, I think 95 and later, but those early days were really important for, like Count Zero said, bringing that hacker community together, where at the time, you know, we were communicating on bulletin board systems. Even though most of us were in the Boston area, we had never met in person. Like we were just sharing information online. And when John and Brian Oblivion started the loft, that was like this kind of communal place to go. And that was a huge thing, because then we got to meet in person, and that's really where it started being this clubhouse, like that more European style community. And that was like a really important thing that hadn't really been done a lot before then. There had been hacker groups, but not really these hacker kind of communes, really is what it was. So that was something where we were all kind of individuals, but supported each other in different projects and bringing everybody together. And then, like Count Zero said, with the flea markets too, we would have people come that weren't even in necessarily the hacker circle, but people from the flea market that we might have met. And it's like, oh, come over to the loft afterwards and like open up all your stuff and test it out and see if it works.
That's
and,
right. That's
you know,
right.
hang out and like, did you get fleed? You know, did you buy something that didn't work? And it was just this fun, very, I would say for me, a very innocent time, because it was this place to hang out with like all these other like really smart, older, more, you know, just kind of well put together, it seemed, people.
You mentioned like bringing the stuff from the flea. That was part of the fun part of the hackerspace, was like, what did you trash at you know, in a dumpster the other day? And you'd bring it and you'd show people. And one of the more fun things I remember is I used to work at Lotus in East Cambridge, and there's a lot of biotech companies there. And one of them was going out of business, and I found a centrifuge and an EKG machine, and I brought them over, and you know, just to start to, you know, share and play with this technology. Like, who has an EKG machine, right? It's kind of random, but we all got access to it. The other part of it was fun, was like, it was a place where people could stop and visit like the hacker community in Boston. Like at the time I actually had the EKG machine, I think it was it Rob Gongrip was visiting us at the time?
Yeah, from Hacktick.
And what was, he was from Hacktick, right?
Yeah,
yeah. And Rob was there, and it was just like, it was a place, it was really just a place to hang out, and just the crossover between hanging out and starting to do projects like, well, what can we do with the EKG machine, right? That was always in our mind, like, how can we hack it?
And that was a time too where, you know, technology wasn't as accessible, right? So like you said, finding an EKG machine, or even finding a computer in the hallways of MIT or something, that was like, oh my God, like, let's bring that back and use it. it's not like you could just go to Amazon and get whatever. Which
Well, you couldn't Google the manual either. Like, oh, we
Right.
got an EKG
Yeah.
machine. How do you use it? Oh, let's just Google the model number and get the manual. Couldn't do
Yeah.
it
that.
all came from this love of wanting to explore technology that we wouldn't normally have access to, and I think that brought a lot of us together also.
And I remember too, and a lot of the sort of supportive infrastructure of the Loft grew very organically. So I remember the one thing I remember very clearly was, we set up all these machines. We didn't have any Ethernet connected or anything like that, because back then you couldn't just go to Amazon and download a hub or whatever. It was still 10^2, right?
Yeah,
Coax. And so anyway, the thing that precipitated it was Doom came out in multiplayer mode. And we were like, wow, we've got Doom running on our computers. Like, there's this thing called multiplayer, but you need an Ethernet network. All right, well, I guess we got to set one up, And so then suddenly we had a network and we're playing Doom on it. And then we had a network. And so people would come over and be like, can I plug this into an Ethernet network? Yeah, we have one. Oh, really? Are you a business? No, we just wanted to play Doom. And
So I still have a piece of CheaperNet. It actually says CheaperNet on the cable. This was a bad piece of coax that we had in our network that would crash Doom. It took us months to find this.
That is
And I
awesome.
kept this piece of cable
Holy
to
shit,
remind me that
awesome.
there are bad cables in the world. Bad
I
cables.
love it. Oh, I love it. That is beautiful. Oh.
Yeah, that was fun setting up the network, because then we could do all kinds of things. Eventually, we got we got a modem, and we got a router, and we connected to the internet. I think it was right 93. It was the Internet Access Company.
We got a nice
Yeah, I drove the
line
modem.
over.
I drove the modem to Bedford to drop it off.
Yeah, so we
would have
dropped off
one at
a
each
pair
end.
of we had the modem and the other modem. I think that was like one of our only purchases was that modem. But
That's why
everything
we
else
started
on the
to go
whole
to the
network.
flea to sell stuff, was so that we could
That's
make money to
true.
buy the modems.
Right, we
We had
sold the
lots
junk
like
we
that.
found in the trash to buy the modems. But one of the fun things was we actually back in '93, like getting a Class C and having your own Class C on the network was something that was easy to do. You just filled out a form and you had a Class C, and you were routed on the network. So back in '93, we had all these machines that we networked for Doom were all on the internet. And I remember people would come back after the 2600 meeting just to like use a Mac on the internet. Like that was totally novel. Like libraries didn't even have it. Even if you weren't at a big corporation, you didn't have access to the internet. And we actually gave hackers that.
I remember the Loft Eye too. We had like an early webcam set up there. And I remember using See You See Me, which was almost like Zoom, but super slow on dial-up. And you could talk to other people, and it was like, holy shit, like, wow, this is high tech. No one's doing this, so it was really
Very cyber.
cyber, total cyber.
And it was a dodgy neighborhood back then too. We had people smoking crack outside the loading
Back
bay.
the crack fiend.
And we even made to the point where like one of us took a picture of this guy smoking crack, and then one of the things I always loved was going to these different conferences, like HoHoCon and I knew the Frack magazine folks, Craig Night Lightning and all those guys. Then we'd have these different cons and stuff. And my thing was I always made stickers, and so one year I made a sticker of like Jack the crack fiend smoking crack, and a sticker, and it said something like the Loft more fun than a pipe full of crap.
I think that was the HoHoCon '92, and I remember, getting to the Loft back then, being a kid without any mode of transportation, I would take the train from my house, and then I would walk from Copley through. You could take the Orange Line also, but that was like way more dodgy. So I'd take the Green Line, walk down through the South End. And every time I would get to the Loft, I'd be like, thank God I didn't get jumped. Like you pass these groups of kids hanging out, and like, I think it was more scary. I mean, I don't know, but I think it was more scary as a teenager because kids are always kind of going after other kids. So getting there, and I had a skateboard, so getting through that area was definitely sketchy. And I remember many, many times Space Rogue driving me home to avoid having to do that, or like the trains closed, right? Because
my old four-door Ford Escort that could barely work.
Yeah, you would drive like a maniac. I remember you were the most insane driver I ever met.
What? No, it was very safe.
But that was part of the allure. Like that space was just an amazing place in the South End, like Zero had said, like it was very undeveloped and kind of raw, and this space was this old loft art space, and like just a very, very cool place.
Well, also in true hacker style, we had free electricity, right? Wasn't that like part of the space? Because we were,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
No air
a
conditioning.
woodworking shop was below us, and they had like really good power. That was part of the allure, is like we had free electricity to run all these ridiculous machines. Like imagine how much electricity a Vax uses.
Oh, gosh,
Yeah, but it
that's
wasn't
right.
an air conditioner. I think the lease said no air conditioners, but didn't say anything about mainframe.
That's right. That's right. That was like, and we're like, oh, we're not going to run an air conditioner. What's that?
We're just gonna
What's
run a
that giant
mainframe.
refrigerator. Oh, that's just, electronics. It's just a thing. It's a project. It's not an air conditioner. There's no compressor. It's-
I also like the way that you guys had talked about like the organic growth of it, right? It's like the network, we didn't just build a network because it was because there was a game to play. And we, it's just this organic growth of like stuff we'd collect at the flea market. And as we work on projects, it would get bigger and bigger. So I think it's important to note also that there wasn't some end goal of having the loft, right? It was just this space for us. So there wasn't this business goal. It was all just like, can we survive? Can we, pay the rent? Can we do stuff we want to do in a cool environment? And of course that morphed over time, but it didn't start that way. And it really was an amazing, I can't even, I still get these emotional reactions to that time of that old loft. Like it was just an amazing place to be.
That's yeah. And you know what? The thing I'm most proud of us as a group. One of the things I'm most proud of was Lady Ada coming in as she was, I don't know how
Lemon.
she was. Lemon. She
14,
was small enough
maybe?
that she fit inside the Vax. Remember that one time she crawled inside the Vax, and she was just this young girl, a tween when we met, and she was just brilliant. And she started coming and hanging out at the 2600 magazine meeting, and then coming over and hanging out at the loft. And it was just like everyone was so helpful to her, and she was the only female, only woman, only girl at the time there, and everyone was just like so supportive of her. And when I've met her at conferences, like at the last 2600 Hope conference in New York, I hung out with her there, and she was like, yeah, those everyone was so nice to me. It was just got me going in like exploring tech, and now look at where she is with Adafruit. It's just like I'm like, oh, that's what it was all about.
Yeah.
It's just
Well, I mean, that
Yeah,
goes
I
to
remember
show-
Veggie introduced me to her at a 2600 meeting. He was kind of like guarding her, like, don't mess
we
with
all
this
were.
little
We
girl.
all were. We were all
And I just remember him saying like, she is going to be something someday. Right. And he just met her for a few months. He's like, she's going to be something someday.
Yeah.
I mean,
Look what happened.
Lady Ada is like one example. There are a lot of people that were in our orbit or were in our influence who hung out with us, who weren't necessarily part of the loft proper, but have gone on to be movers and shakers in the industry. And I think that that circle of people is unbelievably large for the small group that we actually were.
well, I
Well,
think
like Window is a good example. We met Window at the flea market because we sold her Microvax.
Yep.
We're like, who is this? What was she like? 20,
17.
17? She was like a freshman at BU.
I think so. 17 or she was 19. No, she was 19.
And
was a freshman
And
at
she's like,
BC.
yeah, I want to learn. Like, why are you buying this? She's like, I want to learn, how to program it. We're like, okay. And we invited her, back to the loft. Actually, I think you gave her transportation so because she couldn't get it home.
Possibly. Yeah, I delivered the Vax to her apartment. I remember that. And then she hung out at the loft a bunch of times, went to 2600 meetings, and then, went on to super huge, great things. I mean, if you look at her career, it's pretty amazing. And that's, it's just one other example. There's a dozen other people that are just like them that used to hang out in 617, and we were all together and hanging out at the loft, and were influenced by us, and they influenced us. And it's just when you think about the number of people that have gone on in their careers that were involved or somehow associated with the loft, it's really a huge thing in my mind. It's hard for me to fathom that.
I think what's also important, it's not just who went on to successful careers. I mean, you guys literally kept me out of jail. And that group of people at the loft and some of our surrounding people, like everyone kind of looked out for each other. And I looked up to all of these guys as like my big brothers, because I had gotten arrested a year before I joined the Loft, and I was already involved with the hacker community and, you know, with all the guys in Boston. But they sort of kept me a little bit at arm's length. And after I got arrested, my parents were like, you got to do a sport or get a job to like keep you off the streets and causing trouble. But at the same time, they still let me hang out with Count Zero and with Space Rogue, because they knew those guys. They knew they were responsible people, or responsible.
Mostly.
Did we? I don't think we ever actually
make
met
some
your
whipped
parents,
cream
did we?
over here. I got to make some whipped cream over here.
It was a safe environment. So it was interesting how, you know, my parents would pay the rent for my share of the Loft and let me hang out there, even after I had gotten in trouble for hacking related type of stuff, breaking into buildings and things. But it literally saved my life, and it kept me out of trouble for all of those formative years. And I learned so much about how to handle myself, how to share information, the importance of being a hacker, the importance of working together in a group. So all of these things that came out of it. And I think a lot of that influence rubbed off on a lot of other people, just in different ways, right? So it really was something where, again, there was no plan, but how it shaped so many people is really what's amazing. And that's even talking, you know, before we went to the new Loft.
Yeah, I want to talk about some of the milestones that you guys sort of had, not just the day-to-day, but for example, I only know a couple from what I've spoken to Chris about already. For example, when Microsoft wrote you guys, how do a few loose hackers end up getting the attention of Microsoft at all?
Well, so that, I mean, that just came from basically the vulnerability research part of what we started doing. I think we started back at the old Loft, but it just got more of it happened. I mean, I learned from you know, a fellow Bostonian hacker. I'm not going to mention his name specifically, who used to hang out there. You know, I learned like the split VT vulnerability, where you could take over someone's IRC console, right? If they were running split VT, which is, you know, you can split your screen into a couple screens. And he just showed me like that exploit. It was a 0-day. This is like in 93 or something. And I'm like, I want to find those things. Like, that's really cool. So I, you know, that's kind of like at the Loft was where I kind of parlayed my computer science and programming background into understanding, you know, how you can take bugs in software and exploit them. And, you know, so that started to be a thread in the Loft, where we started just doing this research and publishing it. And, you know, when we started doing it, it was that complete, you know, we don't really care what companies will think. We just want to do it because we think information should be free and people should know about these problems. And isn't it cool? Like, you can learn from this and then you can find these problems. It was
also partly a warning to other people who use that software. Hey, look, if you're using the software, there's a problem.
Yeah, public service, you know, just, you know,
and so that started to, you know, we didn't try to like have an agenda. We just started doing it. And then like the tech press started to say, well, wait a minute, what are these guys doing? This is actually impacting businesses and people. And they started to come to us and say, you know, you guys are like making an impact on business. Like, businesses are changing their behavior based on just stuff that you're publishing. And it just kind of built up and built up and built up until, you know, after a few years of that, you know, it started to upset Microsoft. Basically, they're like, this is something we have to respond to. This is something we have to deal with. We like woke people up to the reality that was always there. And we didn't really have any agenda behind it. It was just information for people to use, whether you're a researcher or a user or the company itself. You should go and fix this. And so it got to a point where Microsoft said to us, you know, we think it would be safer for our users and probably easier for us to deal with the press if you guys would come to us and tell us about the vulnerability before you published it on BugTrack. And that was sort of the birth of coordinated disclosure. I think I don't know of any earlier cases except, people used to send bugs to CERT, but it really wasn't coordinated. It was just like you sent it to CERT.
Basically, companies found out about bugs that people published via bug track this at the same time as everybody else. Everything was just full disclosure because there wasn't any kind of protocol for interacting with companies and hackers. The companies would just sort of be surprised about what they saw and had to scramble to fix things. And in some cases that was, portrayed as irresponsible. There was a long conversations between the community and the sort of corporate world about what responsibility really meant and on whose shoulders it fell. If the people writing the bugs were seeing these vulnerabilities, but it would take months and months or never to actually fix the issues. What did you do? Did you, push out proof of concept code? Did you tell the public? Did you go straight to the media? To what end did you need to shame companies into doing the right thing for their users and for the world, rather than their bottom line, which basically many times meant doing nothing? I mean, early on, you asked about Microsoft. Early on, their responses to some of the advisories that I was pushing in things like Internet Explorer and IIS and stuff like that were mostly dragging their feet or telling me not to talk to the media, not to go and do anything. This is back when the email address secure@microsoft.com was answered by one guy, and they didn't have a security team, and there was no process, and there was no rolling patches, and there was no patch Tuesday or exploit Wednesday. There was no process for improving Windows. You got service packs, and you got them once every 6 months or something, maybe once a year early on, and that was it. So the fact that you have to deal with updates every single day, I'm glad to say that we have, had something to do with that. But it just means that Microsoft and other companies that have followed suit have acknowledged that, releasing patches in a timely fashion and streaming them straight to the desktop was basically the only way to keep up with the fact that they've been pushing bugs for decades.
Dill, I think it was the IE4 bug, which was the one that finally woke them up. Yeah. And they said, we better get these guys to send us bugs first because this is just so bad.
Yeah.
Because we would publish proof of concepts that would just work. You did you clicked and it locked up your machine, right? You used the foof bug and the penny.
Yeah, some of the proof of concepts are somewhat neutered. I mean, the early ones could do things like download an arbitrary file and run it. Some of them would pop a calculator up on the screen just to show that it could run a thing. Others would run like the foof bug or whatever was sort of trendy at the time for locking things up. Just as a proof that, this is obviously doing something you shouldn't be able to do and that the, machine was being controlled. So yeah, the early exploits were, I don't know, the line between weaponized and not weaponized was pretty blurry back then. These days, in order to weaponize something, it's got to be like 3 or 4 exploits in a chain. It's like a big deal. It takes you 6 months to get it right. Back then,
like the exchange bug.
Yeah, the furthest I think I ever did like a chain was like 3 or 4 sort of exploits in a row, but it was all inside like the same thing. I did a quadruple inverted backflip exploit back, 2003 or something like that. Anyway, it was harder to write. It's harder to write those kinds of chains today. So back then, though, your exploit, your proof of concept was going to be pretty close to the how you'd actually use it in a compromise scenario. So it was kind of hard to jockey with companies to give them something they could use to prove the vulnerability wasn't just hand waving and that it was worth their time to fix it, but also not give the whole world access to something that could be immediately destructive. So the balancing was a little bit harder back then. These days it's pretty obvious. If something is a 0-day and it can be used to build an exploitable chain of vulnerabilities, and it's like on an edge, like something like SSH or Exchange, one of these things, it can be almost immediately destructive.
And you sell it and make a lot of money.
You can make a lot more money. Back then we just gave that stuff away for free. It's like Bitcoin. It's like you can buy them for $1. Exploits were like a Bitcoin back then, and now it's like $50,000.
I traded them for beers.
Yeah,
it's true.
You've seen the NFT thing, right? This new thing where you can use cryptocurrency to trade art and like fungible, non-fungible tokens. But we need to be putting exploits on there.
didn't Microsoft respond once to some of your early vulnerabilities or something? They're like, I don't remember if this was at the new loft or the old loft, but it was like, no one's ever going to do that, right? Like the vulnerability is completely theoretical, right? And that's how the tagline, making the theoretical practical, turned into something. What was that? Do you remember?
That was loft crack.
Yeah,
Was
that was loft crack. It was the cracking of NTLM and LM hashes.
Yeah, they said because they didn't know they had these implementation flaws in their password. They didn't realize you could hack the what is the LM hash.
Yeah.
Right. So they took the strong hash, which they thought they were protected by, and they said, hey, it can be 14 characters long and 256 different things. It would take millions and millions of years to crack.
Yeah, and then they packaged it, alongside the crappy hash that like only used uppercase letters and had this reduced key space and a really simple algorithm. It was just like, let's put those two together. And it was just like you could just crack one and then it'd be really easy to crack the second one. So yeah,
but
that vulnerability.
They only believed you when you showed them proof of concept code, right? That's the important thing. Is a lot of vendors back then, even hardware vendors today that we still deal with, it's the same sort of thing of like, they legitimately think they're secure. And they're like, no, we don't, that's impossible. No one's ever going to do that. Right. But then once you prove it to them, they're like, oh boy, we better go do something. You call their baby ugly and they're like, they get upset, but then you show them their baby's ugly and they're like, oh my God, we better fix that.
So it comes through why this place was kind of cool and why you guys were joining up, but like, what motivated you guys to get together so much, to do this work, to interact with these companies? Like, what was the reason to stick around and spend so much time with this stuff?
It was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, that's an important question though, because that happened later on in the progression of the loft, right? So like Weld was looking at vulnerabilities in 93, but it wasn't probably till 95, and especially when Dildog came on, when getting the publicity of the vulnerabilities and sharing that information and trying to change people's view of coordinated disclosure or all of that stuff was a much later on thing. But it started just like the original loft started as this curiosity, and it was fun, and that's how it just progressed as the kind of industry or as technology progressed at the same time. So it wasn't a conscious decision all of a sudden to be like, let's do this. It was fun, right? And you got
I think it was loft crack, I think was the demarcation point. Because Dill, I think you came on after loft crack, right?
Just briefly after, I was helping to write the sort of next generation of loft crack code base. Because it started off as just an open source thing, and then there was a Windows port that we did a lot.
Right, because we did the open source command line thing and we gave it away.
Yeah.
And then we realized that companies were making money off our free code. We're like, well, wait a minute. If people are running audits using LoftCrack for free, like maybe we should charge companies $50 or whatever. And I think LoftCrack really was the demarcation for us to go from, oh, this is a fun hobby play around thing, and we're releasing info and making the world better. But after LoftCrack, we're like, okay, we can do all that stuff from before and make some money.
I think also I've done a lot of work over the years before Loft and since then with developing communities of people in different ways, shapes, and forms around technology, around education. And the real seed that carried on, I think, through the whole time of the Loft was this sense of being pioneers. And that is a very unique atmosphere. In the initial days of being a hacker, you were a pioneer, meaning that, there's no Google the answer. There's like, being a pioneer means you're not only in a new space, but you are relying on other people to help you navigate and understand this new space, new information space, new physical environment, new virtual environment. And what happened was in those early days, people forget that, you had to rely on people and social networks and connections to understand what was going on and to discover and then when you made innovations, you then shared those innovations with other people. And the evolution of that going from an open sharing to then communities change over time, but the core DNA stays the same. And then this pioneering community then turned into a business model. Then, okay, now we're going to apply those same pioneering attitudes to business. We're going to, but it all comes down to, I think, the fact that it was a pioneering time. It was so unique in that there was such limited accessibility to information. I was going through my old pictures, putting up different ones here. Here are the old Vaxes outside in the loading dock in the old loft. But we used to, just manuals. I have a bunch of pictures of Brian Oblivion and myself filling U-Hauls full of manuals because you couldn't access them any other way. There were no, go online and look for it. Go Google it. So I think that's
No, I totally agree, John. But I also think part of it was we were pioneering and we had access to resources that other people didn't have because Boston we had a lot of high tech companies, but even more importantly, we had MIT and Harvard.
Right.
And these are places that themselves were researching this stuff. So the stuff that they were throwing away, we were able to, harvest that and be able to repurpose it and whatever, because you really, so it was both like an attitude, but also it was like, there was like fertile land for us to sort of dumpster dive in.
Exactly.
I like that fertile land. That's what it is. It's like pioneers out in the fertile landscape.
Well, you go for the Oregon Trail, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would have been able to do what I did if I hadn't been at MIT at the time and already on. My fraternity house had a whole class B of internet space allocated to it. So I learned about routing, I learned about IP networking and all this stuff just by being there. And then when I realized that 2600 meetings were happening and that the LØpht, who I had seen the website of the LØpht at MIT, I was like, doing in the Athena cluster, doing my homework, and I just perused around, and back then you could probably browse the whole internet if you wanted to, and the whole web. And I found the LØpht homepage. I was just like, oh, these guys are doing some pretty cool stuff, and I just thought nothing of it. On my own, was just like, dinking around with Windows 95 when it came out and realized I could crash Internet Explorer. I was like, okay, actually, this is interesting. I can make this do something. And it was after that, it was like around 1995, 96, that I realized that, oh, wait a minute, these guys are actually just in my backyard. Like, I could probably go find the LØpht folks if I wanted to. But this 2600 meeting would be a pretty cool thing to go and meet other people doing this kind of stuff. So I printed out my exploits, had them on a piece of paper, and went to 2600. Sure as hell, it was like Brian Oblivion and Wes Opal and Space Rogue and Mudge, and everybody was just there, just hanging out, going to get beers and stuff after. It was just like, all right, that was awfully convenient, and we had a lot to talk about. So
yeah, we used to go to MIT after the 2600 meeting to the Athena clusters and play. What was it, NetTrek?
Yeah,
We would go to Athena clusters early on Sunday mornings while we waited in line at the Flea.
Yeah.
And you'd log in as Root with Mr. Root,
Root,
right?
Mr. Root.
It was the same password everywhere.
So many of those machines by accident.
So that was internet access before we even had internet at the LØpht. We would go to MIT to do that.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note though, too, like, because we kind of jumped from the early to sort of later, like there is this transition period in the LØpht that a lot of people don't really talk about, right? And because we had some press coverage, community coverage back in the early days with like Annalisa Savage's Unauthorized Access, which is an amazing documentary that really shows that hacker community spirit, that the hacker ethos of the original LØpht. That's an amazing thing to see. And then you jump to the later time where, we were on a lot of these larger media outlets trying to share what we're doing, but a lot of it was because of vulnerabilities in research and showing what hackers, can do. But there was a real transition between, I would say, this kind of grassroots, scary, dirty warehouse kind of area into moving to Watertown, into a different spot with more of a goal at that point of like, let's see if we can, have a nicer space and sell some, stuff to survive and see if we can do this. Eventually see if we can do this full time. So there was a conscious transition also. There's some of the work we were doing was this normal, natural transition, but the physical movement of the LØpht was another demarcation point that a lot of times we don't talk about, right? And it's like, I personally, like Count Zero was at the old LØpht, he was not at the new LØpht. And that was a major, major shift in how the loft was operating, really.
Well,
And
we
the
also
first-
lost other people in the shift, like Golgo. I think White
That's
Knight
right.
was moving, but Golgo stopped. He didn't come to the new loft either.
That's right. And White Knight, I remember, I remember always starting fights with him in the little parking area loading dock of the loft, even though he was like way older and would always kind of beat me up. But it was like, yeah, it was a major shift, and there were lots of reasons that happened. But being a young kid, I just sort of went along with it. But that's a transition spot. I'm sure Zero has something to say about it, of like, not to put him on the spot, but it's like there was that time where we said, okay, our lease is up, let's move to somewhere different, right? And like that, it wasn't all rosy all the time.
I think
there's always going to be communities change, they evolve, they shift, people come and go. And it was definitely a different perspective. I mean, at the time, like I wasn't interested in stuff as a business, and so, that was that. In retrospect, I'm a lot older now, and I've seen a lot of other things come and go and grow and evolve, and I've been involved in different startups that come and go, grow, evolve, acquire, and all that stuff. And it's the same story. It's always the same story. It's just that there are different, the trick is just understanding where you are in the story, because it is a story that changes over time. Any healthy community will evolve and change like that over time. So it was in retrospect, I think it's the whole story is beautiful, but it is a narrative with like in any other narrative where you have characters come and go and people were critical at one moment and then in another moment they didn't have a role anymore because the story had changed.
That's bring up a good point, Joe, because the fact that we had such major transitions and more than one of them at any point along that, as John calls it, the story, that we could have ceased to exist. Like it could have fallen apart. We all went our separate ways. The transition to Watertown is one of those transitions. The transitions to a business is another one of those transitions. And there's probably a couple other ones if we sat down and analyzed it. So the fact that we were able to keep it together for 8-9 years it was, and then the end game was totally the end game. But I think the fact that it lasted as long as it did is pretty amazing.
I love that explanation. It's a story, right? And communities change and things are sort of evolving as the world is turning and evolving and everything. Did you feel that way at the time? Because that was sort of, you had helped start the community. Yeah, I mean, that was your baby, right? And like, it was such a spot where looking back, it's like, oh, it's a narrative of the story. But for me, I still feel guilty.
No, at the time I was kind of freaking out too. I guess I didn't understand what was happening. I just wanted things to stay the way they were growing in my mind. Right. I was working at Mass General. I was focused on my career in neurology, and I wasn't thinking, I was like, I'm not really interested in, I mean, it's funny. Like if I went back in time, like now I'd be like, yeah, let's do this business. Here's a business model. Let's do this. This is kind of like fun. I'm into that now. At the time I was just like, kind of, clueless about that. And it was just because we're all different people at different points in time in our lives. And at that time, I was just not the right person. I fully accept it now. Back then, at the time, I was just like, whoa, this is messed up, man. What's going on? I was confused more than anything else. I was more confused than I was mad at anyone. And, but, the perspective of time and me having seen how things play out in other systems and my own career path and businesses that I've been involved in, it's like, wow, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And it's like, yeah, this is the rhyme.
So if it really was this sort of old loft, new loft, these transitions as you guys became more mature and a little bit more official and you start to get attention, in what ways did those years affect you? Like through your 8 or 9 seasons of this sitcom, how did you change from Joe, you getting arrested and being this 16-year-old kid, to the people that you guys became when you left? Were you now like full professionals? How did you change during those years?
I have to say that my mindset now is exactly the same as it was back at the loft. And I'm still not as young, but I'm still the same punk hacker kid. I just happen to be able to do what I love to do. But the mindset never changed. and other people have had different transitions, right? Like Count Zero said, the story, everybody's perspective is different, and everybody's place in their life at that time was different. But besides all of the early days of, you know, kind of learning and kind of mimicking what all these guys were doing, the later years taught me a lot about loyalty and how not to run business, and how, you know, support of friends should come first. So a lot more of life lessons than technical lessons that I still struggle with, and I still remember all the time. And every time I do something in my life, it's like, all right, I've had that experience and that didn't turn out well because we didn't talk about it. Or I'm not going to start another business with friends because I didn't like how it ended. And there's a reason why I work almost exclusively independently, except with very few people that I trust, right? So it's a lot of the personal issues that, because it was these formative years of all of the experiences, both good and bad, like were major shifts. I would not be the same person if it wasn't for joining the Loft at first, right? And all of those things. But everybody has a different perspective.
Well, for myself, I was a software developer when I came to the Loft, and then 5 years later, I decided to transition into becoming a cybersecurity professional, and I got my first job doing that, like 97 or so, 98. And I think the same thing happened with Mudge. Mudge was a programmer, and then around that, maybe a little bit earlier than that, he decided to do that. So I don't think I'd be in security today if it wasn't for the Loft, because there was a huge, I mean, it was like, to some degree, it was more important than my career to be part of the Loft, right? It's like interesting, like a lot of people, their hobby is more important than their day job. But certainly in this case, that was that, and that really influenced my career afterwards.
But you said that you turned into doing security even back then, right? It was a much smaller group. Like Dill said, there was one guy working security at Microsoft.com. So getting into a security career, I think was part of the Loft helping create that, or helping raise awareness of
that's true. The Loft almost created the security career as we know it for a lot of people.
We crashed through a lot of walls. We forced the hand of the industry a bit by, you know, pulling their pants down on a regular basis. You know, something had to fill that space. We felt ourselves filled a large quantity of it. Corporations, other companies, people that wanted to do what we were doing, you know, filled that space as we forced it open. You know, making a market has been a thing. You know, being the tip of the spear for InfoSec has been an interesting challenge. You know, we started off with the Loft doing advisories. We then, ended up doing at stake with the consulting thing, you know, legitimizing the careers of a lot of people that would otherwise have done that kind of work anyway, but maybe illegitimately. And then, you know, with Opal and myself, we founded Veracode and proceeded to, you know, automate application security analysis and, you know, trying to take the things that people were doing by hand and automating them so they would scale. So that's sort of a natural progression, is that sort of defining the need, meeting the need, but then scaling as the need grows. You know, that's sort of a pretty standard sort of way of building an industry. Is, you know, when you identify that a need exists, you figure out how to meet the need, but then as that need becomes, you know, as people realize they can depend on it, as, you know, as people realize that security is important and that you know, it's actually something they can leverage, you know, in order to grow online businesses and things like that. You know, if every online business failed because of hackers, there wouldn't be any online businesses. So as, you know, this industry grew up around the security thing as being something that needed to happen, the work we were doing became more and more important over time. It's unclear whether or not we created the problem and then created the solution or not. I kind of laugh at that and, you know, giggle myself to sleep about it every night. But you know, it's more like we were there when the problem was the thing and noted that, hey, you know, as a hacker, you find how to break things, but you also might, you know, catch a glimpse of how to prevent yourself from being able to do that thing? You know, how would I fix this problem? And that's almost just as tangibly interesting. You know, you can break something, but then you can, like, you know, if you can find a way to automate or make it easy to raise the bar on your own attack, suddenly, you know, you're contributing to the public good. And, you know, I always wanted to do that, you know, and I'm, you know, these days, you know, I'm still automating application security, and application security analysis is my job. My private projects are more in the realm of privacy and social media and stuff. I'm not going to get into what those are, but I've got some nascent ideas on how to improve online communication, and, you know, moving in the general direction of identifying problems and trying to find better technologies and ways of solving those problems for people. And, you know, I think that everyone at the Loft has done that in some way through their careers. I don't know if it's changed us personally, like I know it did for me. I know my goals are far more less. It used to be a much more shiny thing is in front of me, I'm just going to play with it. And now it's more mission oriented. Like, I have some goals to improve privacy online. I have some goals to automate application security, and I'm moving more toward goal oriented than I am like the sort of, you know, dealing with the shiny thing in front of me and just playing with whatever's in front of me. You know, so maybe I've changed a little bit in my, you know, how I've, you know, where my drivers are personally, but, you know, how I go about doing what I do is basically the same.
I think also with that transition of like turning the Loft more into a business, there was still the underlying, you know, we're still part of the hacker community. We would still have our parties. I, you know, fondly remember going to the Loft on weekends and just hacking on stuff for no reason, just like back in the day. And Space Rogue was there always too, and he would also drive me home
every day.
So there was still that love of technology, and that love of hacking, and that passion still traveled through this whole story, right? It's just the business side started to make a little more sense of like, hey, let's do this. And like, you know, all the guys had full-time jobs that they quit when we started at Stake. Actually, I had my first full-time job. I had been an engineer for a year in a product development company. But for me, it was easy because I was still young, and it's like, sure, quit the job and try and see what happens. But I think Weld already had a family, and it was a pretty significant kind of shift to try to start a company. But there was always that underlying love. And I think that started to probably die for people, myself definitely, when we were at Stake and sort of saw the realities of the larger picture. And it wasn't just hacking for fun anymore. It was like, oh, the venture capitalists want to make a profit.
Yeah, but before we got to the VC, like the goal was just to make enough money so that we didn't have to pay rent, right? And then it was, okay, so we paid our rent. Now let's make enough money so we can pay ourselves, so we can just hack all the time, right? And then it became, oh, well, we're going to go VC. So it was like stages. Like, it wasn't just like, okay, let's go make $1 million. Let's start small and pay rent.
Yeah,
that's a good point. And do the security analysis for what, like the assessments for CTP and some other places that, yeah, I mean, it was starting to make that transition, but as it got more serious, the fun started getting sucked out of it, I think.
So,
right? As with any business, right?
I think there was another part that it was separate from the business. That was, we were kind of, because we were so well known and open, and, you know, we became sort of a crossover between the hacker community and the business community, between the hacker community and the government. And of course, the Senate testimony was the biggest crossover of that. But because we were open and outspoken, we would have people from, you know, academia, you know, Marcus Raynham, who can make the claim to be the inventor of the firewall, I think, would come over, and certainly the inventor of the IDS, would come and want to learn from us and interact with us. And there was a little bit of a love-hate relationship. He didn't really like hackers, but he was really intrigued by what we were doing. And the government was really intrigued by what we were doing. So I think that, you know, separate from the thread of us getting more business-like over the years, just becoming more open to interacting with government and just other businesses, not to make money, just to educate, was a big part of that, you know, sort of second phase of the Loft before At Stake.
I have a great printout from Gweeds, which was another local hacker from back in the day. It was like Loft sells out, blah, blah, blah. Space Rook shaking his head. It's, but it was a time, like Weld said, we testified in front of the Senate. We were kind of dancing with the government a little bit, not as like rats and not in that form, but as far as educating them about hackers. At the same time, dancing in the business world and then still dancing in the hacker world. Nobody had done that successfully, right? And it was something that was so new, and it pissed off a lot of people. And Guides' article from the hacker side is the hacker perspective of like sellouts, blah, blah, blah. So it was really an interesting time. And then from the academia side, it was like, oh, these guys, how can you even trust them? They're not even using their real names. So we kind of got hate from all these different sides, but there was still this sort of respect or curiosity about what we were doing and trying something new. So it was the love-hate kind of thing. And there was a lot of pressure too, I felt at that point, of you had this reputation of what the Loft was, that was maybe bigger than what we were or something like that. And it
Well, we tried to do that, right?
Well, we tried to, but then it almost went a little too over the top because we loved the press.
We managed the
right?
press. We managed.
We loved the press, but that was important to share that message. But it became a bigger. We had a bigger reputation than I think maybe.
And I think that's partly what saved us. Like, we earned a lot of goodwill in the early years in the hacker community and other areas and other communities. And so when we did finally go to the business route and we did start getting some of that, disgruntled sour grapes put at us, the fact that we had built up the reputation and goodwill amongst the various communities, I think helped us a lot, because it could have gone a lot worse. And we were afraid of that at the time. We were really afraid of being labeled the big sellouts by a large majority of the community. And we did sit that to a little bit, but I don't think it was anywhere near as bad as we thought it was going to be.
And it actually opened the floodgates, right? Because after the Loft sold to At Stake, then it was like a bunch of other security consulting companies started coming with a lot of other hackers that were in the community. So we sort of got the brunt of it. It's like, when a garage band has their first major label, but then after that, it sort of shows, heavy metal is now.
Oh, wow. Rap guys can get, major label deals now.
Yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
The security industry exploded in 2000, if you remember. I have a talk that I give. I have a slide with a NASCAR shot of all the logos of all the companies that started in 2000. And there's like almost 24 companies that were founded between 1999 and 2000. And you have to wonder, where did all these security companies come from? Who are these security experts? Like, they didn't exist in 1998. And suddenly in 2000, you have 24 companies being security experts because they were all hackers. Right? Nobody admitted it, but they all got VC and they all started their own companies. I could name half a dozen. It was Foundstone, right? Garden, At Stake. Anyway, there's a bunch more. ISS, right? Got eventually bought by. Anyway, where did all those companies come from? They were all hackers, right? And they all got their VC and they all, whatever happened to them after that. But it was 2000 and the Y2K fear, and some of that money bled over into security industry.
There's another interesting point about that. It's post Loft, but I think worth mentioning as far as that transition of hackerdom to more well-known, security stuff is when we had started At Stake, one of the big primary motivators is like, the executives were like, yeah, hell yeah, we're hiring hackers. We're going to tell all of our clients, yeah, we use hackers because they understand the technology, blah, blah, blah. Really proud of it, right? And
that was before the executives showed up, right? After the real executives came, that all ended.
Yeah, it was very early on. And it was like, we had shirts. It was like At Stake and on the back, hacker, right? Because when we sold the Loft to start At Stake, it was very important for us to try and maintain what we were doing of this vendor independence, vendor neutral. If we find a vulnerability, we want to release it. If we're doing security research, we want to do it regardless of who our customers are. And the early executives were very much into that. But then, as the board got bigger or whatever, more less security executives came in or people from that world. They're like, wait a second, no, hackers are bad. So like, our entire career of trying to, or 8-year career of trying to share this hacker message of like, no, not all hackers are bad, totally went down the toilet. And then they totally switched their tune and would never even mention that we were hackers. So you did have this, where all the people came from, I don't know. There were some from the community, but there were a lot that just all of a sudden became experts. And at the same time, it's like trying to sort of, change history and rewrite history. But hackers are important, and they were then, and they'll continue to be important. And whether they're on the bad side or the good side, it's keeping everybody going. And it is kind of a cat and mouse game these days, but to try to pretend that you're not a hacker or that you don't have that mindset is to me sort of ridiculous.
Well, guys, we've already been speaking for over an hour. So I suppose I'll only ask one more last question to get any last thoughts out there. In our world today, the world of the MS Exchange hack that looks so much different than what you guys were doing back then. You look back, what is the legacy of what you guys were able to achieve? In what ways did you influence the world that we now have today? And if LØpht were still around, if you guys were all working in, the one LØpht together, what would you be doing with all of your collective brains?
I'd be running the LØpht Foundation, the nonprofit segment of the LØpht Heavy Industries, which would be involved in educational outreach.
We should do that. That's amazing.
LØpht Foundation.
I think that's a deep question. I think the legacy is maybe just showing what a group of like-minded, passionate individuals can do. But I think it also shows, at least the early days, that you can do things and explore and be curious and just live life without this ulterior motive of trying to be successful or trying to make money or however other ways you define it. Of course, that's easier said when you're young, but you can do great things without always trying to worry about being famous, being rich, being whatever, right? Being social media influencer, all this stuff. I get a lot of emails of people saying, oh, how do I, become a hacker? And it's always like, well, if you're asking that question, then you probably won't be, because you can teach the technical stuff, but you can't really teach the mindset. Though I try a lot of times. But the LØpht just was at this perfect time in the world and in technology, and it was just an amazing spot that maybe not exactly could be replicated, but you've seen sort of hacker spaces build off that, and communities build, and maker spaces and other more public spaces kind of grow on that. So I think it just shows the power of community if people are passionate and work together.
I think it's at the frontier. It's about the frontiers too. It's the legacy is the importance of the right types of hacker mentalities around frontiers. Frontiers always exist. We always think that we've conquered them all. I study history a lot, history of technology adoption. People always assume, yeah, we've conquered all these frontiers. Like for example, one frontier I've been involved in since the LØpht passed was the whole blockchain Bitcoin space, which didn't exist pre-2010, right? And there's always frontiers, and the trick is to find the people with the hacker mentalities who are involved in the frontiers. And I think LØpht, the story of the LØpht, is a perfect example of how that technology frontier and community could grow.
Both John and Joe, you both mentioned like hacker mentality, and that's a big part of my current job, is because I run our internship program here at IBM at X-Force Red, and I'm constantly looking at resumes and interviewing students who are going through cybersecurity degree programs at prestigious universities, which totally did not exist, when we were around. And a lot of these kids are really bright, and they have a lot of technical knowledge, but I have to weed through 1,000 resumes and look for those students who have that hacker mindset, because that's what we're looking to hire and run them through our program. And I think it's a big part. I like to think of the legacy is that we're trying to promote and forward hackers, right? And people who are generally curious about technology and how to make it do stuff that it wasn't designed to do. So that was what we were doing at the Loft, right? We were just trying to bend tech into our will. And so, and you're right, Joe, you can teach the tech stuff. I can teach you whatever you need to know tech wise. I cannot teach you how to think. And that's what I need I need people who know how to think like the hackers.
And it was a
lucky to have
lifestyle
you.
too, right? So
They're
it
lucky
was
to
a
have you as
lifestyle.
the internship leader.
So for me, I think part of the legacy is like challenging your environment, like challenging the world. Like, don't take everything as face value as dictated by the government or by academia or by corporations, because we blew all that away, right? Like we didn't take any of that stuff at face value. We're like, what does it actually do? How can I manipulate it? How can I change things by educating people about something in a different way? So I think for me, a lot of it is, challenging the status quo, and don't be afraid to, do some research and then educate the world.
Yeah, and that's more important now probably than ever, right? It's like you really have to question and think on your own and try and not necessarily trust but prove, right? Trust but verify, and all of these things. That is sort of that same mindset. And it's, if people can look back and be like, oh, the Loft did that, like maybe I can try to do something like that. But I think that's a great point.
Yeah, the thing that stuck with me was the fact that the kinds of, I guess you could call it intellectual property, but the information that we generated at the Loft, things we discovered, that stuff was powerful. The key to activism is knowing that the information that you have is powerful and that you can change things with just a little bit of the right information. I see a trend over the various years, over the last 10, 20 years, toward online activism and hacktivism, and people leveraging hacking skills to make an asymmetric playing field to tilt things toward their particular aims, and you could affect some very good change in the world and shine light in dark places that need it with a very little bit of information and a little bit of skill. And the Loft did that early on. Companies were brushing these huge bugs and vulnerabilities under the rug for their own gain because sure as heck was easier to ignore them than to fix them. But it was just a little vulnerability, text file or an exploit that was able to shift the direction of some of these large companies. The same thing is happening now with countries and political parties and organizations that affect public policy, and huge companies that are social media giants, have these horrendous privacy practices, and it's the little actions of hackers, which are actually minuscule, honestly, that are having the biggest effect on making public good policy changes that actually happen out there. I've gotten a real bent lately for online activism and dealing with communities that are extremely toxic, and how can hackers help? The thing that is important to remember when you have all these sort of built up hacking skills that you've worked on over the years is that they're not useful unless you do something with your skills, change the world, make an impact. It can be through a very little thing. You can change the world through a keyhole if you're doing it right. And that's, very much what I learned at the Loft was, that it didn't take a lot to make a big effect. And, I hope that other hackers and other, people with a position where they can take that little bit of leverage and make good things happen in the world, that they take the opportunity when they get it.
Guys, this was awesome. Thank you. We could have gone for 2 more hours. I'm going to end the recording here.